Awesome. Still admitting a couple more folks to join us. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Want to say thank you for the privilege of your time today. I will be your host for this technical assistance webinar. I'm Cynthia Davis. I'm the Senior VP of Sustain SC, and Sustain SC is a nonpartisan economic development, commerce-driven, and conservation-minded not-for-profit organization. And go to our next slide. There we go. The mission is to connect the sustainability goals of our South Carolina businesses with local solutions for the benefit of our economy, environment, and people. So you will learn about 3 of these local business solutions that are available today as we continuously strive to seek out solutions and make connections to improve our state and reach our sustainability goals together. Okay, let's take a look at today's agenda. This is the first technical assistance webinar of 2025. It is all about how to achieve carbon neutrality, what sustainability benchmarking has been done, and what are those results, and then what are some assessment tools that are available to you and your company. So the way we're going to run this is I'm going to talk about the roadmap to Sustain SC, and then I'm going to talk about what this accelerator focuses on, which is our Sustain SC metrics and reporting accelerator. Our first guest speaker will be a Sustain SC member, Daryl Whitt from All 4. He is going to talk about what is carbon accounting. And then Kait Sagan from Gel Engineering, who is also a Sustain SC member, is going to talk about the corporate sustainability benchmarking reports that she did for us. And then our Sustain SC partner, SC Fraunhofer USA Alliance, Suzanne Dickerson is the director, but we are going to have Dr. Marcel Schaefer do the talking for her today, as Suzanne swallowed a frog and cannot talk. So they are going to talk about the sustainability maturity assessments that are available. So these are tools out there that companies can use, which is very exciting to have that. Okay, so Sustain SC is focused on the Sustainability Development Goals, or SDGs, that are in alignment with our priorities. The roadmap to Sustain SC is our strategic framework of 7 accelerators derived from input from our membership. Let's take a quick look at these 7 accelerators that we focus on at Sustain SC. If you were to draw a graphic organizer of this slide, it would have connective lines between all of these concepts, but what's most important are the strategic partnerships that we are building to have a robust sustainability network in order for business to business to take place locally. Partnerships is literally the heartbeat of our organization. So today, we're going to focus in on the metrics and reporting accelerator. And then, as you'll see, as the 2025 year unfolds, we will be doing TAs on each of these things. All righty, on this slide, you'll see the priorities that we've identified through an analytical study conducted by EY in 2022. And that teased out what our priorities will be for each accelerator. So that's on the left, the priorities identified. We want to increase the availability of high quality, timely, and reliable data. We want to increase South Carolina company tracking and data management towards meeting sustainability targets. We want to develop and gain Sustain SC member agreement for collective targets related to resilience planning, renewable energy, and emissions. So what are we actually doing along those lines? Well, we're identifying members interested in knowledge and data sharing. If you are one of those people, please put it in the chat, give me a call or email, and let's talk about how we can help you with that. Kait is going to go over the completed premium and corporate member Sustain SC sustainability reports that she did using the data that she gathered in 2024. And then we want to establish what are foundational South Carolina industry sustainability metrics. What is it that we can all agree on that these three things we're going to measure? Is that going to be scope 1, 2? Is that going to be water? Is that going to be air, energy? What is it we can all agree upon? And then we want to be supporting our suppliers with reporting targets. All righty, so we're going to get started with our first speaker, and this is Daryl Whitt. He is with All4, and Daryl's going to tell us a little bit about himself, and then he's going to give us a fantastic presentation on carbon reporting.
Oh, good morning, all. Thank you, Cynthia. And as Cynthia said, I'm with All4. I'm the technical director for climate change and sustainability within our sustainability practice. And I'm a chemical engineer by degree. I got that about 35 years ago now from Clemson. I've been in the environmental field and sustainability since then, working most of the time in consulting, but also spent a few years actually in the pulp and paper mill as an environmental engineer there. So as we talk about carbon accounting, that is basically the process that you go through to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. And as Cynthia was saying, the metrics that we want companies to measure around sustainability, probably the first one to address is your greenhouse gas footprint, understanding what your emissions are. So if you'll go to the next slide, Cynthia. A big question is why? And the reason is that carbon reporting these days is changing. There is a lot going on in the arena of greenhouse gas emissions reporting and efforts to decarbonize, which is making reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of the reporting that we see today is regulatory driven out of the European Union. There's the Corporate Sustainability and Reporting Directive, the CSRD. There's also a regulation called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. There are new regulations going into effect now in California that are the Climate Accountability Package, which includes what was called SB 253 and SB 261. SB 219 just simply made some amendments to those. All of these are regulations that apply to any company doing significant business within these jurisdictions. So it's not just companies that are located in those areas, but anybody doing business there has to be paying attention to these regs as well. So this will impact South Carolina manufacturers that are exporting to Europe or that are doing business in the US getting to California. There are a couple more that I have listed here under the regulatory drivers. One's the SEC disclosure rule. Officially, it's been passed, but it's also been withdrawn because of legal challenges. We'll see where that goes under the Trump administration. There are also other regulations that are state-driven that we are seeing increased regulation. Particularly New York and Vermont have now issued some state regulations as well as California. We're also seeing a lot of carbon reporting requirements requests from stakeholders, whether that is your investors or your customers. They are asking companies to report through the CDP or through EcoVadis, or they may have their own framework that they are requesting suppliers to report through. Microsoft is an example, Walmart's an example, that they have their own frameworks they want you to report to that are not CDP or EcoVadis. So next slide.
Before you go to this next one,
sure.
I wanted to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And we, while you're thinking about it or you hear something that you have a question about, go ahead and put it in the chat. And then after each speaker, wraps up, we'll address all those questions. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Daryl.
Sure. Okay, so when you were talking about quantifying your greenhouse gas emissions, what do you do to get started? Well, the first thing is you probably want to follow the greenhouse gas protocol, and here's a copy of the cover. Um, it's the standard that is used around the world most commonly for quantifying emissions, and it organizes your emissions along your value chain into 3 scopes. I'm sure you've heard the term scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That comes from this standard. And it's much like an air emission inventory that you would do for regulatory permitting for NOx, SO2, VOCs, except we're quantifying greenhouse gases. And it then uses what are called global warming potentials, or GWPs, to make those different concentrations of gases comparable. And they all compare to one equivalent unit of carbon dioxide emissions as far as the potential to cause global warming. And it's required standard for most of the reporting frameworks. Okay, go ahead. So I mentioned scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1, if you're not familiar, is those direct emissions from your operations. So if you're burning any fossil fuels or releasing any other greenhouse gases from your operations, which does include any company-owned vehicles, those are scope 1 emissions. Then scope 2 emissions are any purchased utilities. Now, primarily that's electricity, but it could also be steam, heat, or cooling services as well. And those are emissions that occur at the utility company site at the request of you to get the electricity. So they generate electricity for you to use. The emissions resulting from that are called scope 2. Then everything else along your value chain, from original raw material extraction through final disposal of your product at end of life, are all considered scope 3. And that's what's on these yellow arrows, are the 8 upstream, the 7 downstream categories, as they're called, that result in your greenhouse gas emissions. And if you don't know, the greenhouse gases are those gases that are listed across the top, just for your reference. Go ahead.
This is such a fantastic slide, Daryl. It's one of those that, I'm going to print,
It's a
and
key reference.
it is. It's a fantastic reference. And
And
just appreciate you sharing that with everybody.
it's not ours originally. It came out of the greenhouse gas protocol. We've just redrawn it. Makes it a little easier to read part of it.
It's fantastic to understand. Thank
Yep.
you for that.
Yep. Okay, so scope 3 is where we're seeing a lot of focus today. Companies are asking about scope 3 emissions. And the real key to understanding scope 3 emissions is when your customers are asking for scope 3, what they really want is your scope 1 and 2 emissions, because along that value chain, that's their scope 3 emissions. So likewise, when you go back to ask your customers for their emissions, that's scope 3 to you, that's scope 1 and 2 to them. And you'll also hear them referred to as product carbon footprint or environmental product declaration, embodied carbon. They're all ways of getting to how much emissions are related to your product, your operations. So those are all tied together. And you see these requirements anywhere that you're reporting. They're talking about your scope 3s. They now get included in Science-Based Target Initiative goals. They're also required under the CBAM regulations. And there are some federal procurement regulations that also want to know about your carbon footprint. That's what they're talking about, is your scope 3 emissions. Next slide.
I love that definition of what scope 3 is. Also very helpful and easy to remember.
Yep. Okay, so why are scope 3s important? Well, all of the colored bars across the top are scope 3 for various industries. And the hashed bar down at the bottom is scope 1 and 2 for those industries. So it just visually makes it very clear that the majority of emissions for any industry, any business, really are scope 3 emissions, not scope 1 and 2. And that's why there's so much focus on it now, to pay attention to make reductions in, yes, your scope 1 and 2, but also paying attention to what's going on with your scope 3. Next slide. Okay, so when you're thinking about making reductions, there's kind of a hierarchy of what you want to go through. First off is energy efficiency. Basically, make sure that what you're doing now is as efficient as possible to minimize your emissions. And you may do an energy efficiency assessment, or you may do what's now being termed as a decarbonization assessment. They're a little different. I'll get into that a little more in a minute. But once you've got your stuff as efficient as possible, then you look at electrification, which would replace any fossil fuel burning operations with electric equipment. And industry is moving in this direction pretty well right now. Then once you're talking about electrification, there's also looking at alternative energy sources like on-site solar, or using a renewable fuel like renewable natural gas or hydrogen. Those are renewable replacements for fossil fuels. And you may also look at buying renewable energy credits or making power purchase agreements for the purchase of renewable energy. And then if you can't reduce it any other way, then you may want to buy carbon offsets to basically replace what you're still emitting. So that's kind of the big picture strategy for carbon reductions. Next slide.
Yeah, and that carbon offsets, that is the last one on the list for a reason, because
Right.
you want to be more efficient by doing all those things before you go to that step. Yep.
That's
So
right.
I like how it's placed at the end. Oops, sorry.
That's all right. So electrification. Electrification, I mentioned, is converting equipment that's currently burning fossil fuels to use electricity. And I'm not going to say this is an easy thing to do. It's very hard for industry. I mean, if you've got a natural gas fired piece of equipment, it's really hard to go in and tell the plant manager that we want to replace that and spend $1 million installing an electric boiler, which the electricity is probably also going to be more expensive than the natural gas to do. But if you are trying to make greenhouse gas reductions, that's what it's going to take. And that's what we're going to have to face and going to have to move forward with. So it's not easy to do, but electrical equipment today in many cases is more efficient than fuel-fired equipment. If you think about it, the energy going into the equipment and then into your product is much more efficient through electricity than it is through fossil fuels. There's no lost heat in the process, or reduced lost heat. It does, when you're electrifying, it shifts your emissions from being scope 1 to scope 2. And the good news there is that the emissions on the grid are declining. So when you shift from scope 1 to scope 2, the footprint goes down overall. Electrification does also lead to opportunities for solar or other renewable implementation. And it does also provide you opportunities to reduce through RECs or PPAs. Next slide. Okay, so as I said, the grid is improving. This is the grid region for Virginia and the Carolinas. And as you can see, over time, it's been going down. If you look at the last slide there, it's the emissions from the grid have gone down about 44% since 2007. So it's really good news that the electricity we're buying off the grid is more renewable than it used to be. Next slide. Okay, so when you're talking about other alternatives after you've electrified, then there are on-site generation, primarily solar. Solar is the most practical, commercially demonstrated technology to generate electricity on your own that is fossil free. For a 1 megawatt system, you need about 6 to 8 acres of real estate to put it on. That may be the back 40. That may be your parking lots. It may be your roof, depending on, structural availability on the roof. But there are options to come up with that space. 1 megawatt system will generate about 1,450 megawatt hours per year here in the Carolinas. That number varies a little bit across the country, depending on, how much sunshine you get. And the cost for a megawatt system is somewhere between 900,000 and $1 million for that. So just ballpark numbers there to keep in mind as you're thinking about going on-site solar. One of the other things about when you're generating on site is it'd be really good to have some sort of storage system, probably batteries, so that you can continue to operate when the solar panels are not generating. So you use batteries to balance your generation and your demand. And a battery energy storage system, frequently we're seeing lithium ion or LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate chemistries in the batteries. Those are the technologies we're also seeing in electric vehicles. The cost is somewhere around $450 per kilowatt hour of storage. And that's if you're thinking about a 6-hour storage capacity, or $600 per kilowatt for like a 2-hour. So there's some cost variation depending on how fast you want to be able to discharge the electricity to use it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Daryl, before we move on, we have a question from Valentina.
Yes.
She asked, what about the negatives that have been associated with electric batteries and the issues with what to do with them end of life? Can you address that?
So lithium batteries do have some concerns. There are some legitimate fire hazards and other issues with lithium batteries. The lithium iron phosphate batteries have less fire hazard concerns than lithium ion. But we are learning how to deal with those. Industry is improving the safety record all the time on these. And as we go forward, it's going to continue to improve. Likewise with end of life, we have a lot of battery recycling companies that are popping up in South Carolina. Redwood Materials, Serba, and others that are working to answer that question around what do we do end of life of a lithium battery. So, the industry is working very hard to address those issues as we go.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so real quick, what are RECs and PPAs? A REC, a renewable energy credit, is a fungible certificate, basically, that says you are paying for somebody to generate renewable energy. And normally the way these things work is, if you think about a traditional energy generation, they burn fuel, they generate electricity, they put it on the grid, you pull it off of the grid for your operations. With renewable energy, it's the same way. They generate it in a utility scale operation. They put the electricity on the grid, but they generate a certificate of renewable energy credit that is separate. And then you can buy that credit so that when you take electricity off of the grid, you can retire that credit and therefore claim that you were responsible for the generation of that electricity and you used renewable electricity. So it's separate from your electricity, but it's a fungible certificate that you buy. Now, under a power purchase agreement, you're actually buying that certificate along with the electricity from the utility company. So the utility company generates renewable energy and they sell it as a package with the certificate to you when you buy your electricity. That is basically the way a power purchase agreement works. And then the last one, as you mentioned, Cynthia, is offsets. And an offset, if you go to the next slide, works basically the same concept as a renewable energy credit, except that it's taking some action to either avoid emissions or sequester emissions in some sort of process. Kind of the classic to think about is planting a tree. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You take credit for the absorption, the sequestration of carbon into the tree, and you create another fungible certificate called a carbon offset or carbon credit. And then industry can buy that to offset emissions that they weren't able to otherwise reduce. That's basically the idea of an offset. Now, we've heard a lot over the last year about the quality of offsets and whether or not they're viable and if they're permanent and all that sort of thing. Those are things that are very important to consider when you're buying carbon offsets. You really want to make sure that you're getting good quality offsets, and that's making sure that they are permanent, making sure that they are additional. So you're not claiming to sequester carbon in trees that are already growing out there. You want to make sure that it's something above the business as usual. And also they're verifiable, that if somebody wants to go visit your site and see what you're doing, they can actually see that you are doing something to reduce carbon out of the atmosphere. Okay, so next slide. I think my last one, I think. Last year we did a carbon assessment and we actually offset the emissions from the symposium so that we could claim that it was carbon neutral. And all four helped put that together for Sustain SC. Our scope 1 emissions, if you think about it, there weren't any operations that were really Sustain SC's emissions, but they did have some scope 2 emissions where they're buying utilities at the venue. And then the big piece was scope 3. So under category 1, we had the catering. Under category 5, they were composting all of the waste generated in the process of the symposium. So because it was composting, it was only 8 kilograms of CO2e generated. And then the big piece was everybody who traveled to the event. We estimated mileage and types of cars, and that turned out to be about 16,000 kilograms of emissions just from everybody traveling to and from the event. But we did work with a company called Climco to make sure that we had good quality offsets and purchase offsets from them. And those funds went into nitrogen oxide or nitrous oxide emissions reduction projects that are actually located in the Southeast. So we were funding real reductions that were occurring geographically local to South Carolina. So.
Yep, that was a really interesting project. That's the first time I've ever gone through something like that. So that was really fun and cool to be able to work with the Climco folks and be able to choose something that's close to home. So thank you for connecting us with them. So do you want to say anything about this one?
No, this was really just to answer questions, put something up there. But let's see if we have any other questions no, we've only had Valentina's. So
yeah, I don't see anything. Well, you did such a fantastic job taking the big concept of carbon neutrality that's very comprehensive and complex and breaking it down into parts that even I can understand. So thank you so much for that, Daryl. And so naturally, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Now that we have that foundational knowledge of what scope 1, 2, 3 emissions are, let's pivot to Kait Sagan, and she's going to tell us about the benchmarking reports that she did.
Hi, thank you, Cynthia. You can go to the next slide. My name is Kait Sagan. I am the sustainability specialist for Gel Engineering. We're an environmental consulting and engineering firm headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina. Next slide, Cynthia. So what am I here to talk to you about today? I'm here to speak on Sustain SC's 2024 Sustainability Corporate Benchmarking Report. So this is an annual investment benefit for premium and corporate members of SustainSC, and I had the amazing privilege of being able to collect data and compile this analysis for these reports this year. So if you've ever had the joy of reading a sustainability report or compiling data for a sustainability report, you will know that there's a lot of information in there to work with and to analyze, an opportunity to benchmark against other organizations. So through conversations, we sort of came to the scope of this study, which is really to benchmark environmental impact between organizations, member organizations of SustainSC. So this includes emissions, water, and waste. And I think before we sort of get deep into it, I love to zoom out a little bit and really just, again, harp on the point where sustainability is so important as a first step towards making meaningful and positive environmental impact. Really, the point of reporting is to decrease our impact over time. So I'm really excited to speak more on this report. Next slide for me. Perfect. So the graphics are a little wonky in the brush over, but the indicators that we chose for this project were as follows. Daryl did an amazing job speaking on the different scopes of emissions, so my job's a little easier, but we benchmarked scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of member organizations, both location and market-based, which I'll touch on a little bit in the next slide. We also wanted to sort of even the playing field between the different industries that are represented in SustainSC's membership. So we're talking everything from Boeing and BP to EY and Heritage. So there's very different scopes of business and scales of business there. So really to level the playing field between these, we determined to benchmark scope 1 and scope 2 emissions per $1 million of revenue and also per employee. We also benchmarked calculated scope 3 emissions as well as water use. And a quick note here, there is a bit of variation in reporting when it comes to water reporting. So if a company reported their water use, that's what we used, the data we used. If they didn't report water use, we reported water withdrawal, which is the water a company withdraws from a system. And if a company did not report their use or withdrawal, we reported their consumption, which is the net between their withdrawal from a system and what they put back at the end of their industrial process. We also sort of scaled, again, the water use with intensity per $1 million of revenue and per employee, so we could more accurately compare across membership. We also benchmarked waste production and landfill diversion rate. Next slide for me, Cynthia.
Yeah, and before we go on, Kait, I just want to encourage the audience, if you're sitting there going, why didn't they include such and such as one of these indicators? Please put that in the chat because we would love to have your feedback as we're constantly trying to improve what our processes are and really trying to address what our member companies are looking for. So yeah, please put a question in there or put a, did you think about in the chat for us? That would be awesome.
And so I included this slide to sort of go over some of the more technical aspects, but Daryl did such a good job that I don't really need to. So scope 1, again, those are direct emissions. Scope 2, those are indirect emissions from the purchased electricity of an organization. In the greenhouse gas protocol, which Daryl mentioned, there's 2 different ways to calculate your scope 2. There's location-based emissions and there's market-based. Location-based, what that really means is your electricity consumption multiplied by an intensity factor. That's a regional average for your grid. So for example, I'm in Charleston. Our regional average for our grid is over 600 pounds per megawatt hour of electricity produced. So it's location-based is much more broad. Market-based, on the other hand, it's the calculated emissions based on specific electricity procurement choices. It includes renewable energy and carbon offsets. So that's sort of the difference between those. Both are valuable and both are reported. So they're both included in this benchmarking report, as well as scope 3, which, as Daryl mentioned, includes all other indirect emissions. Next slide.
Thank you, Kate. I did not know about location-based and market-based until this experience. So thank you for sharing that and helping us understand better.
Of course. And so getting more into the data collection component of this, there are 33 identified premium and corporate members of Sustain SC. And so we were looking at data, publicly disclosed data from all of these members. The primary publicly disclosed data source came from published sustainability reports. And if there was a gap in an indicator that we were looking for that wasn't available in the report, we would look at other disclosures, especially for like revenue and employee count, but also on emissions. Sometimes a company would report their scope 1 and their market-based scope 2, but they wouldn't report their scope 3 or their location-based scope 2. So if that occurred, we would turn to the CDP Climate Change 2023 public disclosure reports, and that's where we that's where we gathered that data from. The most recent completed data available was used in this benchmarking report. Also, something we found was that different units were used for reporting for either waste or water. So conversion factors were used, and also for revenues, average annual exchange rates were used to sort of convert and make the data standardized. Next slide. Okay, I know this is a lot of words, but stick with me. There's some limitations of the study that I do want to address earlier on. One of those is not all Sustain SC members publicly report their sustainability metrics. This is really important because we have sort of an incomplete data set to do the benchmarking from. The second one I also really want to point out is that a lot of this reporting is global in scope. So if we're talking about BMW, they're reporting for all of BMW that operates globally and not necessarily specific to what happens in South Carolina. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward, like with Sustain SC and with this benchmarking report. Also, as I mentioned, membership varies in size, industry, geographic location. So that adds some variability. Not all members report on all the chosen sustainability indicators for this study. And this can either be because it's not material or important to a certain company, or they just don't want to publicly disclose that indicator. There's also a lot of variability in the clarity and accessibility of sustainability reports that I think is important to point out, especially when it comes to water and waste reporting. And also, for the scope of this study, we focused on environmental indicators. And as Cynthia was talking earlier about the roadmap of Sustain SC, we know that sustainability is a lot more than just environmental sustainability. But I did want to point out, we're just focusing on this for this study. Next slide. Perfect. So now we're sort of getting into what was presented to members who received these reports. So first off, we provided members sort of where they rank among other reporting members for the intensity calculation. So company A would receive a report back that would say you ranked 5th out of the 16 reporting members for your scope 2 market-based emissions per employee. What also was provided is sort of what I've snapshotted here, a lot more data. So for one, this sort of blanked out column in the middle is each specific company's reported performance for each indicator, and then next to it are the average, median, and range. And all three of these statistical indicators were provided to sort of give a comprehensive view of what membership reporting looks like. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, a couple next slides. But in this last column, I also wanted to point out, we also indicated the percentage of members who actually did report on each of these indicators, which I find very fascinating. All of them sort of hovered around 50% and upper 50, lower 60% of corporate and premium members, which is very interesting. Next slide.
Yeah, and the only other thing I was going to say too is that we love having this data now so that as we continue to do this year over year, looking at what the changes are, either going up and down, our range is changing. There's so much statistical analysis that we can do with it. So just very excited to have this, baseline data.
Yeah, so some report highlights I wanted to point out. 70% of corporate and premium members have sustainability disclosures, and 64% of members report on at least one of the chosen indicators. So sort of the main difference between these is that there's two organizations that do have a sustainability report, but in that report, they don't necessarily report on the indicators that we chose for the study, if that makes sense. Please let me know if you have questions about that. 9 members reported on all the chosen indicators in this benchmarking report. And another thing of note is they're all publicly traded, which I find interesting and also makes sense. And talking about publicly versus privately held organizations as members, 88% of the publicly traded organizations disclosed at least one of the indicators, as opposed to only 37% of privately held organizations disclosing at least one of these indicators. Next slide. So just a quick focus on one of the indicators, just for fun and based on time. The most frequently reported indicator was Scope 1 and 2 emissions, market-based. And if you remember from Daryl's earlier conversation, a lot of the focus in the sustainability world is on emissions. So this sort of makes sense. 64% of members reported this, and I've listed the average, median, and range below. What's really fascinating is we range from just over 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to over 31 million. So that really shows the scope of really the industry and the different types of businesses that are in Sustain SC membership, but also to sort of provide context of sort of where all this data is. We've also provided the average and the median to sort of have an understanding of the skew of the data. So since the median is significant, is below the average, that sort of means that there's really large company emitters that are emitting a lot more than the most of the members, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about. Cynthia, would you like me to answer questions now or later? I'll just finish it up and then I'll answer questions.
Yes. Do we have any questions?
I just saw one pop up, but I'll just finish this up.
Okay.
Just some key take-home messages and next steps to sort of think about as moving forward. I always think it's important to sort of zoom out, and why we spend all this time and money on reporting and data collection is really to decrease our impact and to see the amount of high quality data out there and the amount of effort people are putting into that is really, really assuring. And also for future opportunities, like Cynthia mentioned, moving forward, having this sort of data where we can compare year over year. Is our impact changing? Are we decreasing our emissions overall as Sustain SC membership? I think will be really valuable. Also something that we could benchmark in the future is really what reporting frameworks are we using? I know we didn't really talk about that today, but there's a lot of data and variability in that as well. And then also, I think one of the largest limitations of this study is that the data is global in scale and not necessarily South Carolina in scale. So is there a way moving forward that we can get more South Carolina specific data? And I'd be interested in hearing conversations about that. But yeah, that's all I got.
Yep.
And answer some questions.
That's awesome. And so we just hired someone that is an expert in corporate sustainability reporting, Emily Skaggs, who comes to us from Milliken. So putting, Emily alongside with Kait and Daryl and some other members that are experts in this, we are very excited about what we're going to be able to produce for our members for 2025. So Valentina has a question. What would you say the main reasons why publicly traded companies versus private report more? And I would say it's probably because they're required to. What do you think, Kait?
I agree with you. Yeah, publicly traded companies are more required to, especially like Daryl was talking about CSRD reporting in Europe. They have to report their sustainability data, and private companies don't have to. It's more voluntary. So yeah, if you have any questions, there's my contact information. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Great job, Kait. Thank you.
Cynthia, if I
Now
can
we
hop
are
in on
gonna-
that too.
Yeah, go
Private
ahead.
companies frequently are quantifying these things, but just aren't making it public.
Right. Yes, they're keeping it in-house so that they can track their 2030 targets, but not necessarily, yeah, disclosing that publicly. That's a good point. Okay. So let's move on to the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness. We have from the SC Fraunhofer USA Alliance talking to us today about sustainability maturity assessment. And so there are 3 assessments. Very excited for this opportunity and these tools to be available to us here in South Carolina. And instead of Suzanne Dickerson, we are going to have Dr. Marcel Schaefer talk to us about this.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes.
Apologies that I am standing here and talking to you and you don't hear the voice of Suzanne, but that would merely be a task of lip reading today. So I'm standing in. So thanks for having me. Maybe a short introduction of the actual listed speaker. Suzanne Dickerson belongs to the Council on Competitiveness. Most people call them SC Competes. They manage a number of different statewide initiatives, including industry clusters like SC Logistics, SC Aerospace, SC Tech, as well as our educational workforce development programs. She's the director of the SC Competes for the SC Fraunhofer USA Alliance. And South Carolina is the only state that has this partnership with the alliance with South Carolina and Fraunhofer. And I'm Marcel Schaefer. I'm with Fraunhofer USA. So I oversee all our activities in South Carolina, and I support Suzanne in spreading the word about this wonderful partnership between South Carolina and Fraunhofer. Essentially, not yet. Essentially, we provide dollar-for-dollar cash match funding for South Carolina-based organizations who want to improve their competitive position through technical assistance and support projects that combine one of our state academic institutions and expertise from the global Fraunhofer network. So Fraunhofer has more than 32,000 researchers and scientists around the world, more than 90 plus institutes globally, and is considered the world's largest applied research organization. So Suzanne's and my job every day is to wake up thinking about what exists inside South Carolina universities, and inside the global Fraunhofer network that is useful and valuable to South Carolina businesses, and to match those up in the form of a project application that can be co-funded by us. To that end, now you can go to the next slide. Since one of the hardest topics within industry these days is about sustainability objectives and targets, I'll be talking about some of the tools that we have in our toolkit that we can deploy in South Carolina-based companies to help them achieve those activities. Next slide, yes. I want to discuss the Sustainability Maturity Assessment tool developed by Fraunhofer IPT in Germany. They are the Institute for Production Technology, and Fraunhofer USA, more specifically our center in Maryland, that's all about artificial intelligence and software engineering, Industry 4.0. In general, this tool is used to compare an individual organization to peer organizations so that they can see how they perform, benchmarking basically against those other organizations. Next slide. Oh no, there's a right side already. So this tool really comprises the significant assessments. The first is the Circularity Capability Assessment, already highlighted here on the left. And the second in the middle is the Strategic Lifecycle Assessment. We talk about both of them. And we have recently added the Regulatory Foresight tool, Regulatory Assessment. I will talk about this one as well. So highlighted in red, let's talk about circularity first. Next slide, please. Of course, there are circularity capability areas in various parts of organizations, like in strategic fields, such as those on the far left, in logistics operations, like those highlighted in the middle, and of course, in facility production technology areas. Next slides. So let's talk about the methodology for measuring maturity of circularity in these organization areas. We'll dig deeper into these ones. Highlight here the one circularity management and reporting. And next slide, or next click, the circularity production. Next slide. So this is how it is basically broken down. So in this example, it shows the results of measuring organizational strategic area of circularity management and reporting. And as you can see in this example, the company is performing far better than most peer companies with an overall score of 3.2 compared to the average of 2.1. Next click. So on the right side, you can see why that is. In every area of this element, they're far exceeding the benchmark, the round circles on the graph. So that adds up to a very high score. I would note here that the minimum and maximum range is generally low for supplier data collection, which will clearly be necessary for addressing the challenge we hear from companies who focus on expanding their reporting to scope 2 and 3 emissions. We heard about these earlier. In this case, the company shown is doing better than most. But I'm not going to disclose anything. Yeah, next slide, please. Nope.
You going?
Yep. So let's look at the facility element of circular production. As you can see again, based on a comparison of performance in this element compared to the peer group, the company is performing above average, primarily based on their remanufacturing capabilities and their renewable energy commitments. Next slide, please. So back to the main slide, we're now focusing on the strategic life cycle assessment. Yes, so what is really nice about this tool is that the scope can basically be scaled to the company's preference. So we heard a lot about CO2 measurement earlier. You can see that a company could focus on only this, only that, if they want to narrow scope, or they could broaden up to the whole life cycle assessment areas and include all of these and other elements as well. Next slide, please. Similar to the circularity measurement approach, here you can also see how the company is performing against the benchmarking line, notably poor in ozone depletion and somewhat average performance in the other areas. The dashboard on the left gives the company a visual of, for example, high water use and action required in ozone depletion, which is much higher than the peer benchmark. And the breaker chart on the right shows a detailed composition of how the global warming potential factor is calculated and provides some practical recommendations for how to improve that score, such as alternatively using gray water instead of tap water for production to improve performance. Next slide.
I don't know what gray water means. Does anybody know?
Yeah,
I'm not
so
going to
gray
put you on the
water,
spot. Yeah,
so
thank you,
gray
Daryl. Go
water
ahead.
would be wastewater that's not really extremely dirty. For example, water coming from sinks where people may be washing their hands a lot. It's been used, but it's not really dirty, or other operations within a facility like that.
Mhm.
So the
Yeah.
second use water or second life water, something.
Right, and use that in production instead of something that, is pure enough to drink. You could use it would serve the same purpose if you were to use this gray water.
Yeah, if
Okay.
you have a machine that needs cooling, you don't need fresh water, right?
Right.
You can also use some other.
That makes sense. Thank you.
So the regulatory assessment, the regulatory foresight tool, as we call it, is essentially a platform based on a company's own profile creation for identifying, understanding, and recommending action based on compliance, adherence, risk, efforts, and benefits. So you can see it can include scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 considerations. Next slide, please. The slide shows the classification of the regulations, transparency into federal level, state level, and so on, but also the level of impact to the various regulations in terms of importance and significance to the company in case of non-compliance. So, next slide.
Yes, and this is the tool that has not yet been used. It is just being launched. So excited about this. I think it will be very helpful to our companies.
Yeah. So probably the most valuable is the recommendation of action, so an action plan in plain English based on the regulatory requirements, and in this case for hydrogen storage component. So you can see there's a lot of different things within that you have put in, and then you get a real plain English notification, plain English text, and then you can basically also go through the action plan in order to, well, fulfill your requirements. And that's this one.
Alrighty, so does anybody have any comments about the regulatory tool? Josh, I thought I saw Josh is the creator of this. You are on here. Josh, anything you'd like to comment and say about this tool?
I think you covered it very well, Cynthia. So thank you, and Marcel. But in terms of that, yes, we're excited about, we have this prototype come off this project with the Fraunhofer IPT folks, and we're definitely looking into finding partners that are interested in this cutting edge development.
Okay, so you all are looking for companies to raise their hand and say, yes, we would like to be a pilot company utilizing this tool, feeding Fraunhofer data about it. That is the ask.
Not
yes,
feedback.
I was going to say the caveat is when we say data, it's not like actual when most people think of data like data from a database. Data to us in this case is feedback, user feedback,
right. Feedback of the tool.
Right. Not like, give us your databases. Right now user interaction is the gold. Yep.
Okay, and Marcel, you had a comment too.
No, that was my comment. Like feedback on how the companies would like use it. It's a prototype. We can shift it towards something that is maybe more applicable, or if there's something similar or some add-on that a company would need, we're happy to do something like that. But then we would need feedback from those people who work with these things.
That is fantastic information. Thank you so much. And here is Suzanne's contact information, Marcel's contact information. Just so excited to have that partnership with Fraunhofer, because you all are continuously addressing needs, problems, challenges, and coming up with tools and solutions for that. So just so excited to continue to work with you all. And again, if there are any companies out there that are interested in raising their hand and being a pilot, please contact myself, Suzanne, or Marcel, and we will make sure you get that information. I know we're at the top of the hour, 12 o'clock. If you could hang with me for just another couple of minutes. We ran a little long because our speakers are so fantastic. We wanted to make sure we got in all the information today. If you are not a Sustain SC member, you do have full access to all of these resources. So please go onto our website. Please look at the events that we have. We have some events that are members only, and I would be happy to talk to you about what our membership benefits are. But then we have other events that are open to the public. So this first one, January 30th, with Sustain SC Members Luncheon with Department of Environmental Services Director Myra Reese. And all of these things you can register for on our website at that link at the top. But what she's going to talk about is protecting and preserving South Carolina's air, land, water, and coast through science, service, and sustainability. And this is sponsored by all four. So thank you, Daryl, for that. Then February 4th, we have a B2SN. So that stands for Business to Student Networking, and that will be held at the Darla Moore School of Business. We have several companies that have contacted me and said that they would like to be there at that networking event. If you are a company that is looking to hire a business student with a minor in sustainability or a strong interest or a certificate in sustainability, please get in contact with me. We want to make sure our Sustain SC members have this opportunity to network with these students that will be graduating in either 6 months or a year from now. We have Recycling Day at the State House. This is in collaboration and sponsorship with the Carolina Recycling Association and also the South Carolina Department of Commerce recycling team. There's registration link on our website. Then February the 11th, our next technical assistance webinar is going to cover RMI's South Carolina Energy Report. So some of you were at our meeting back in September when Lachlan Carey was able to give us the results that he has so far. We got some feedback from members, and now he's going to deliver the report again, and that is going to launch us into our February 20th First Energy Roundtable Series event, which will explore the demand side of energy from residential, commercial, and industrial perspective. So you guys, that is 5 events in 5 weeks. We are cooking with, we can't say gas, but with an affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy source. It could be low carbon natural gas. We'll say that. We just want to thank you on behalf of Leslie Scarden, our CEO, Kristen Austin Gunter, our Senior VP for Conservation, and our new Marketing, Events, and Communications Director, Emily Skaggs, and myself, Cynthia Davis. We are excited. We are fired up to work together with you at the crossroads of commerce and conservation and to build a more sustainable South Carolina. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.